Asylum, the radical mental health magazine, celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. So I'm speaking with Hel Spandler, who is the current editor of the magazine. So, Hel, do tell us why and how was Asylum set up?
Okay, yeah. So Asylum was set up, 40 years ago, spring 1986. It was set up really because at the time, the government were implementing quite a radical-ish, in radical inverted commas, um, initiative to shut down a lot of mental health hospitals and asylums and introduce community care. And we were really concerned about that, not because we didn't agree with it, but because deinstitutionalization program was occurring under a very, very, very right-wing neoliberal conservative Thatcherite government. So we were really concerned that that would be happening in a context where it probably wouldn't be very conducive to what we'd consider to be good community care. So some of the people involved in us in setting up the magazine, which I wasn't involved right at the beginning, were inspired by Trieste, which was a radical, a more collective type of radical mental health initiative that was about closing asylums in Italy, which happened in Trieste, and there's lots of really interesting stuff about that been written. So we wanted to kind of introduce some of those old ideas in the UK, but also have a debate and a conversation about what community care might look like in the UK and how to resist some of the worst excesses of kind of individualism, which we thought would be happening. And I think it was already anticipated that what would probably happen would they'd close the mental health hospitals, but then people wouldn't be getting much community care, and that really it was kind of like an ideological pursuit, but not a particularly radical pursuit in the sense that we might consider it. So it was a radical kind of right shift that was much more about saving money, about fiscal things, about selling off asylums and what's actually happened is they've become sold off as luxury flats and all the rest of it. So it's kind of more about money than it was about a genuine desire for proper community care facilities. So there was a kind of weird conflation between the right and the left, in a sense, which was like there was a general consensus that asylums were bad, but it's like what's gonna replace them. So we wanted to be part of the conversation to make sure the shift was much more to a sort of collective provision and collective responsibility for people who were suffering with mental health conditions, rather than a kind of individualistic kind of laissez-faire, leave people to their own devices sort of thing. So that's kind of how we got set up, really. And we invited some people from Trieste to come over to the UK, and after that we were sort of inspired by them to set up a magazine to promote those sorts of ideas. And there was a big meeting, a big trade union meeting actually between which was the union that's now Unison. I can't remember what it would have been called then, Cozy or something, who had a big meeting where they were kind of discussing amongst trade union members about how that might. And I've written about that. We can link to an article I've written about the kind of the first meeting, which was initiated by a trade union activist, Lynn Bigwood, to kind of have a conversation about that with her local trust. And from that, we kind of the magazine was developed. So there's quite a lot written about its initial development.
Cool, fantastic. Tell us a bit more about Trieste and what happened there.
Yeah, so Trieste was a sort of flagship of the democratic psychiatry movement in Italy. So there's a guy called Franco Basaglia and his wife Franca Basaglia, and a group of mental health workers and some patients, I think, who wanted to close the asylums for a much kind of more progressive reason. And Trieste was their kind of flagship, where they did close the asylum, but also open, rather than just selling it off for profit, they opened up the buildings to become much more sort of community facilities and break down the barrier between patients and the public, if you like. So they became more sort of creative, like worker patient cooperatives, a lot of creative, film showing, lots of creative sort of workshops and activities and stuff like that. So there's a lot now written about Trieste. And what's interesting is the important book about Trieste and about the movement was called The Institution Negated, which was never translated into English until this year. And John Foote, who is Paul Foote's son, has just done a translation of that book for the first time in the UK. And John Foote also wrote a wonderful book called The Man Who Closed the Asylums, which is about the development of the democratic psychiatry movement and how it sort of developed from Trieste onwards. So it's a long kind of history. And they were probably the first country in the world to kind of officially close the asylums as a policy, but also from, at the time, a more sort of left-wing collectivist perspective rather than a more right-wing. I mean, things have shifted a lot in the last 40 years in relation to that, but Trieste still exists, although not in the same form, and it's still a bit of a global flagship for more progressive mental health initiatives that are more kind of about collectivism, really.
So you refer to that as an exercise in what you call democratic psychiatry, and Asylum's original strapline was a magazine for democratic psychiatry. Could you explain a bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so why we were called the Magazine for Democratic Psychiatry was because that was the movement in Trieste, was called the Democratic Psychiatry Movement, in Italian, Psychiatria Democratica. So we initially called ourselves that because that was sort of the mission, really, was to introduce those ideas into the UK, because there was quite a lot of resistance to that in the UK, and lots of the government, obviously, because it was seen as, because Basaglia was a Marxist, he was an anti-fascist activist, so the association wasn't something the Tories would want to embrace, and also because it was a more of a collectivist kind of project. There was a lot of resistance to it in the UK, so we wanted to introduce those ideas. So we called it the Magazine for Democratic Psychiatry to kind of signal that, but also as a kind of a idea of, like, we wanted mental health services to be more democratic, i.e. to actually involve workers and service users in discussions about how services should run. So it wasn't just a sort of top-down exercise in how services should run, but would be truly democratic, that would involve patients, workers, members of the public as well, and family members, friends and stuff like that. So it was a genuinely democratic sort of endeavour, which is still the struggle that we're at, really, because the mental health services still aren't democratic. So it's still a project that we would stand behind, really, that idea, and also the idea of having the whole idea of democracy, which is obviously a debated term, what that might mean, but it's certainly sort of about people having a say in what happens, but also having dialogue and debate and discussion about how things should happen. So Asylum's always been about having a debate and having a discussion, an open discussion and debate between patients and workers, service users. And we always try and prioritise patients and workers grassroots on the ground, if you like, in terms of delivering and being at the coal face, I suppose, if you want to call it, in relation to
so you mentioned earlier that you weren't involved in setting it up. So when did you first start reading Asylum? Where did you find it? And what impression did it make on you?
I think I first found it when I was wandering around radical bookshops. Do you remember them? Radical bookshops in London, when I was in London in the late 80s. And I would hang around in various radical bookshops, obviously, like Houseman's, and there was one on Tottenham Court Road, which kind of Colette's bookshop, was it called? I can't remember what it was called now. There were various radical bookshops around, and I used to sort of go around them, and I spent a lot of time in libraries and stuff like that, and archives and whatever. And I think I came across it in a radical bookshop initially, and then started reading it. And then I ended up doing a master's in Sheffield, as you know, and I as part of the intake, I showed them an essay I'd written, which they ended up saying, "Oh, this is great. We'll publish this in Asylum," which was about the Socialist Patients Collective in Germany. So when I went to Sheffield to study with Alec Jenner, who was one of the people that set up the magazine, he was one of the tutors on the course, or one of the people involved in running the course. He used to have editorial meetings at his house, so I joined the collective then. So that was in about 1990, something like that. So I started reading it in the mid '80s, and then got involved in the collective after having an article published in it. I think that's how it kind of worked, which is often how it happens with new people getting involved as well now.
Yeah, sure. And we've already talked about how the original strapline was the magazine for democratic psychiatry, and you said that Asylum still stands by that approach, but it has changed its strapline, hasn't it, to the Radical Mental Health magazine. When and why did you change it?
We changed it a few years ago, and I can't remember exactly when. Several years ago, and it was partly because I'd been involved in some discussions around introducing Trieste and some of those ideas in the UK, and I was involved in a meeting with various people from that movement, and I realised that it was still quite led by psychiatrists. And we were also getting a lot of criticism from the survivor movement about democratic psychiatry, and some people said, well, psychiatry can never be democratic, it's an oxymoron. So there was that discussion. And also, mental health services are about much more than psychiatry, really. So we wanted to broaden it out, because a lot of people, and we don't have many psychiatrists involved in the magazine. And since Alec left, and Phil Thomas used to be involved, and we haven't had that many. And it kind of felt like it wasn't really where we were at anymore. We wanted to broaden it out a bit. We didn't really know what else to call it, and mental health is a kind of problematic term in lots of ways, but it's also the term that people associate with it. It's what things are called: Mental Health Act, the Mental Health Services, mental health policy, and people describe themselves as having mental health issues or blah, 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 blah. So it's a term that people know what it means. And why we called it the Radical Mental Health magazine is because we wanted to kind of contest that a little bit and have a radical take on it in a different way. So we were thinking of calling it the magazine for mad studies or something like that, but we realized that wasn't really what it was, because mad studies was a bit of an academic
Yeah.
kind of project in some ways, although it's more than that. But we didn't want to tie it down to kind of just about sort of scholarly activity, because it's much more about of activism, and it's not just about mad studies either. A lot of survivors and workers don't necessarily associate themselves with mad studies as a discipline. So we wanted it to be kind of more than that or bigger than that. So that's the term we came up with. We may end up changing it again at some point, but that's sort of where we alighted on.
Cool. So, Asylum gives a lot of coverage to the way in which mental health patients, service users, people experiencing mental distress, how they are mistreated by institutions, by the police, the justice system, etc. Why is it so important to Asylum to report on these things?
Because no one else is, really, to be honest. That's one of the things I think. I mean, I should have said this earlier. One of the things that I was always impressed with about the magazine was that it was, putting those perspectives forward. You don't really see that when you see mad people with mental health conditions in the media. It's often, either people who have overcome these struggles in some way, or it's like people who've done terrible things. It's not. And actually, people with mental health conditions, as is well known now, are much more likely to be victims than persecutors, if you like.
Mhm.
But also, it's people with mental health conditions are still one of the most oppressed and marginalised groups, even amongst progressive people. We still say things like, we still use mad and crazy and bonkers as a term of abuse. And one of our previous editors, Terence McLaughlin, used to say, we were the last great civil rights movement. I'm not sure that's quite right, because I think there's plenty of other civil rights movements that are probably needed to have and are happening as we speak. But certainly, I think it is really important, because no one else is really covering it. And a lot of time when people with mental health conditions are, standing up and saying what's happened to them, they're often not believed because of their mental health conditions.
Mhm.
It's often minimized, gaslit, told, maybe it's because of their mental health problems or whatever. So we feel like it's really, really important. And I know from personal experience, and I know from knowing people and being involved in stuff, that you know, people are treated really bad in the mental health system. Not always, for sure. But in society and mental health systems, the criminal justice system, they can be treated really poorly. And it feels really important that someone's standing up for that and saying it, and including articles by people where that's happened to, or about those things. So, and to highlight that and have regular features to keep it on the agenda, really.
Cool. Excellent. So, um, yeah, so that links into my next question actually, which is why platforming the voices of mental health service users is so important to Asylum.
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, we do like to platform service users and workers and activists. There are three main sort of people that we would, and they're obviously they cross over. They're not distinct categories.
Yeah.
A lot of people that we publish are probably all three of those things, or some of them, maybe two of them at least. Um, but certainly for patients and survivors, service users or refusers, whatever we want to call them, they are, people that aren't really listened to in society. They're not. It's not a movement that's covered. I mean, even that, for example, the current important civil rights movements. For example, the neurodiversity movement and the trans movement, which has a big overlap with
Mhm.
mental health movements and survivor movements, but they are covered in the press, not always positively. There's often a backlash against them, but the survivor movement hasn't even been covered in the national press. It's still not even. I mean, people now, because I didn't know there was such a thing. It's
Mhm.
only people who are involved in it know about it actually happening. So it's really important that that still gets highlighted, and that we platform those voices that aren't heard in the mainstream press, really, and aren't necessarily believed
Yeah.
or taken seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so because you've got this mainstream narrative, haven't you, about mental health, is that mental health is an individual issue, it's a medical issue, and where people need to be treated or locked away from the
Mm.
rest of the people. How does Asylum challenge that narrative?
Yeah, so in terms of, I mean, partly by people, by a multitude of voices coming together to put forward alternative perspectives around that, and also to highlight the fact that whilst mental health conditions are felt personally, and they are personal in the sense the kind of emotional impact and stuff like that, they are collective. We feel it collectively, and it's often in relation to bigger political, social, economic, environmental things that are happening in the world. So one of the things that we try and do in the magazine is connect personal individual suffering with bigger structural issues. So that it's not about, whilst you know people feel it as an individual, that we need what's needed is to collectivize that. So bringing people's voices together to realize that people aren't alone, and actually it's actually a collective struggle, is a really important thing to do. So I think kind of locating that within a broader context is sort of what we try and do, really, in the magazine. That's one of the things we try and kind of prioritize. So seeing where that suffering is threaded through, and it doesn't mean that it's simply caused by that mental distress is necessarily always caused in a simplistic, reductionist way by, but we do know, for example, that, the links between things like poverty, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, all those things, racism, that the links are clear. The way that's played out and the way it actually happens is quite complicated and needs a lot of attention and unraveling. So what I think people do in the magazine is to kind of explore that and explain that in lots of different ways, to kind of unpack it and see those links much more clearly.
Sure. Yeah, because so we're talking about challenging the mainstream narrative. Um, but that doesn't mean that everyone who challenges the mainstream narrative agrees about what they would like their narrative to be. So there are quite a few different views among people who object to the mainstream narrative on mental health. Some of them reject the idea of mental illness altogether. Some of them reject medication, for instance, um, and others don't. So where does Asylum stand on that?
Mm.
And where do you personally stand on that?
Mm. So, okay, so there are two distinct things where I stand and where the magazine stands, and there is an overlap there. So, the magazine doesn't have a view on it in the sense that we embrace and will publish a variety of different perspectives on for example, whether mental illness exists or not. I think part of the problem is we have to be aware of the context in which these debates are being had.
Hmm.
And at the moment there's I'd say quite vicious attack on welfare claimants and on people claiming benefits and people who are off sick and stuff like that. And there's a real attack on the idea of mental illness. It's almost like that people are faking it, people are putting it on, it's not real. And unfortunately, that overlaps with this idea of mental illness and the deconstruction of mental illness, or the kind of problematization of this idea of mental illness. As far as I'm concerned, I think I don't really care that much in terms of what people want to describe their suffering. And I'm happy to, some people feel that they are mentally ill and it feels like an illness. And I have a lot of sympathy with that, because when you're very, unwell, it can feel like an illness. For many other people, they really hate that. They don't like the idea that it's an illness, and they see it as some kind of, a bit like the neurodiversity movement, that it's a kind of different set of perceptions and experiences or whatever. And my view is that we need to, because we're referring to so many different things, we need to take the lead from the person that's experiencing it, rather than what we think is the right thing to call this thing or not. So I don't particularly have a problem with illness, because for me, mental illness is about people suffering, emotional suffering, if you like, and we can all agree that well, I hope we can agree that exists. So in terms of the magazine, we have a very, similar approach, in the sense that whatever's the mainstream narrative, particularly if it's an unhelpful narrative, we will find various ways of interrupting that. And at the moment, that might be to actually say that mental illness does it exist, if you like. I mean, I think it's a sort of like a bit of a red herring, in the sense, because there's all sorts of things like mental illness is a thing, or whether psychiatric diagnosis exists as a thing, and all that sort of stuff. And it can get round and round and round in circles. And I think most important thing is what is going to be the most important way of describing something that will end up meaning that we can make demands on the state, or make demands for better support, better services,
Hmm.
for people. And that's the most important thing, regardless of kind of what we call it, if you like. And I
Yeah.
think, unfortunately, there's been a tendency to kind of spend a lot of time arguing about whether mental illness exists or not as a thing, and all the rest of it. And actually, pretty much at the moment, it's really not where the struggle should be, I don't think.
Yeah, interesting. And it kind of links on to what I'm going to ask you next, which is how good do you think the left is, the socialist left in particular, on the issue of mental health? What is it getting right? What's it getting wrong? What more could it be doing that it's not doing?
Well, historically, I think that the left has always been good at highlighting, things like resourcing, the rights of workers, stuff like that in the system, which is great. But often, well, not often, sometimes the rights of workers and patients are tricky to unravel, and they can seem like that they conflict, particularly when one of the things that people often complain about in mental health services is the actions of mental health workers.
Hmm.
Things like forced treatment, forced medication, sectioning, and people, not being believed, all that sort of stuff often happens at the coalface, the people who are actually delivering that care. And sometimes what's been demanded by trade unions isn't always what might be helpful to patients. So there can be a little bit of a conflict there. I don't mean there has to be, and there needs to, and I know there's been quite a bit of work thinking about how service users and trade unions and stuff can work more closely together. I've forgotten your question now. Oh, the left, sorry.
How good do you think the left is at? I mean, I think my answer is not very good at all. But how good do you think the left is at even understanding mental health and mental distress?
Well, yeah, I mean,
and then what it does about it.
Well, I think what's interesting is that a lot of people on the left have experienced mental distress, as a lot of people have. You know, because we live in distressing times, and mental health issues, conditions, whatever you want to call it, is quite prevalent amongst people who live in this world at the moment. But I don't think the left has historically been brilliant, because I don't think it's understood the more radical critiques from survivors. I don't think that, for example, as I said before, using madness as a term of abuse or whatever, which we kind of all do sometimes, it's a slip of the tongue because it's ingrained in us. But I think the left could do a lot, and that's one of the things about the magazine as well, is we've always tried to intervene, if you like, or have some kind of presence in amongst the left. It's interesting because the anarchist left have always been a bit more receptive to the ideas in Asylum, because I think Asylum is quite a libertarian sort of, prospect, the idea of the magazine and stuff. So, and I think anarchists kind of get where we're coming from a bit more than traditional socialists have done, because I think it's often been a sort of top-down kind of exercise, and sometimes a bit paternalistic as well, around it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I know there's been a lot more recently from theorists and writers and campaigners and stuff that are trying to link these projects. I mean, the right has been shit on it as well, so it's not that the right have done a good. I mean, they're certainly
they're shit on everything, aren't they?
They shit on everything, yes. So they haven't done it, but we'd expect the left to be a bit better on this, and they haven't necessarily been. It's always been a bit of a struggle to get the left to kind of get on board with some of these issues. So it's it has been a bit of an uphill struggle, really.
Okay, so next question is that I should declare a personal interest here as Asylum's poetry editor. But the magazine features a lot of, alongside all the articles and news reports it also includes poetry and visual artwork as well. Why is it important to Asylum to include creative work?
It's essential for Asylum to include creative work. We always have done, right from the beginning. We had cartoons and poems and stuff like that, and we want more of them, actually. I mean, one of the things when I started reading the magazine, it was a lot more long-winded art. We did have poetry and other more creative stuff, but there was a lot more long-winded essays and stuff like that, including we talked about before, my essay was in there. We took up bloody half the magazine. And there's no way I would publish that now. I'd publish a much, much shorter version of it, if at all. And so I think one of the things is it's a magazine. It's not like an academic journal or anything like that. And also, there are different ways of portraying and getting across messages. And what I've realised over the years is, people experience the world differently, which is often like neurodivergency or madness or different ways of being. People perceive the world differently. People understand things differently, and people get messages differently. And some people read long reams of text and love that. Some people don't. Some people see visually, and some people like shorter. So we need to have a variety of different ways, not only to reflect different ways of being in the world, but also different ways of understanding the world. And I wrote something a few years ago I did a little project about the cartoons that were in Asylum, what are called single panel cartoons, like little single sort of images that are cartoon-like. And, you know, there's been a long history of survivors, patients, workers, mostly patients and survivors, doing these kind of cartoons and getting across really complex, critical messages in a really nice, simple way that just directly gets at it. You know, like on demonstrations when people make their homemade placards.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love them. I hate corporate placards, you know, of a political
Mm-mm-mm.
party, whatever persuasion. But I love it when people do make their own little. There's one placard with some message on it, and I love them. And they're really and you look at them, you don't see all the ones with all the, you know, the big
Yeah. I
socialist
mean,
type names. Put that
if
on
long
them.
articles could express to everybody exactly what people want to say, then nobody would have bothered inventing poetry or cartoons or placards.
Exactly, exactly. And I think they are like little placards in a way. And in a way, I see, like, you know, the magazine used to have little placards. I mean, if you think recent cover images of the magazine, they're often like little
Mm-mm.
placards on the
Mm-mm.
front cover and stuff like that. And I think those things can get. I think articles get your head. You can kind of understand them in your head, but sometimes poems and images get your heart, if you like, your soul.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm,
they go in a different way. They make you feel. And we also include stories as well, written stories, both personal stories and fiction, and they go in a different way as well.
mhm, mhm.
And as an academic in my day job, if you like, I'm quite bored of, you know, a lot of academic written
Yeah,
text-based things, and I want to see much more diversity and variety and creativity in how we communicate. So it's incredibly important, and I want more of it in the magazine, really.
cool, excellent. So, big question coming up. What do you think Asylum's achieved in its 40 years, and what do you hope it's going to achieve in the next 40 years?
It's difficult for me to say because I've been involved in the magazine for most of its existence, really. So I don't. It's hard for me to say what it's achieved, because I'm too close to it, and sort of, and its current editor. So, but I suppose if it's achieved anything, I would like to think that it's kind of created a bit of a community,
Mhm.
of people who write in the magazine, who buy the magazine, who circulate it, stuff like that. And also, I mean, I think about what happened when I got my first, you know, my essay published in the magazine, and how important that felt to me. Like, oh my God, someone's actually interested in what I've got to say. You know, it's published in a magazine, you
Mhm.
know, and the kind of feeling you get from that. And so, which is really important in terms of validating people's experiences, validating people's knowledge, validating what people have got to say, the fact that what they're saying is, you know, is going to be published, isn't going to be published in some mainstream magazine or newsletter or something like that, in the press, but we publish it. So I think just validating people's experiences and getting them out there, I think, is a massive achievement in a
Mhm.
way. I'd like to think it's a massive achievement. Whether it gets into the corridors of power, if you like, is another matter, because mostly the magazine goes to individual subscribers. It doesn't really go to, very few institutions subscribe, very few libraries even subscribe. It mostly goes to individuals. So, but I hope that people, you know, it get, and I hear about it getting around on the circuit. In fact, a colleague told me that our recent article, on Palantir, was circulated in a meeting, at a Unison meeting, you know, around sort of highlighting the dangers and the threat of Palantir in our NHS.
Mhm.
So, and that's the perfect thing that Asylum can be used for, is, you know, people kind of, you know, hearing about something for the first time, perhaps, or hearing about it in a different way, and then kind of going, oh shit, have you heard about this? And then people passing it around, and it
Yeah,
actually making a difference, to people. And, you know, a kind of consciousness raising sort of exercise. So I think in terms of consciousness raising, in terms of solidarity, in terms of, like, you know, developing kind of community, peer support, all that sort of stuff, I feel like that's that's quite an achievement. And the other thing I'd say is it's an achievement to be still here after 40 years,
absolutely.
particularly because magazines aren't really, I know they're making a bit of a comeback now, but you know, it's really hard. It's really
Mhm.
hard to keep a magazine going, particularly
There's a
with all
lot of
these.
mags set up in 1986 that aren't with us anymore, aren't there?
There certainly are, yeah, and there's lots of things in this field are very short term. You know, they call them, you know, was it ephemera or something, which I think is a bit of a you know, I think there's some brilliant things that have not been around for very long but did a
Mhm.
brilliant job. But I think, yeah, I think still being around as a magazine, there is nothing like it in the UK, that's for sure. There's, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing like Asylum
Mhm.
magazine elsewhere like that does that. There are other things in other countries, you know, in you know, similar sort of project. And in fact, this is an achievement. There have been magazines set up in other countries, like Kosovo have set up a magazine in Albanian that was directly influenced by Asylum.
Fantastic.
Last year, it's called Semenje. I think that's how you pronounce it. And they, you know, they were literally inspired by the magazine. And we often get people from other countries, not often, you know, quite regularly get people saying, we want to set something up like this in our country. You know, how do you do it?
Mm.
What do you do, sort of thing. So we've got, you know, examples like that, which I think is an achievement as well. So that, you know, there are little things that we are doing that is there, and hopefully will continue. So in the next 40 years, I don't know, I'm certainly not going to be around in the next 40 years. I would like to see sort of succession. So one of the things I really want to see is, you know, new people, younger people coming forward to take over the magazine. A great example of that is there's a lovely group called the Neuromancers, who are going to do a takeover of the next issue of the magazine. So the summer issue of the magazine will be a takeover by the Neuromancers, who are a group of young neurodivergent people who are sort of challenging all sorts of things in all sorts of wonderfully creative ways. They're a brilliant project, and they came to us and said, we'd love to do a special issue of the magazine. So what I'd love is more things like that, more individuals and groups coming forward to saying, yeah, we'd like to
Mhm.
either take over an issue of the magazine and or maybe take it over at some point. And also to highlight new things that are happening. So for example, neurodiversity is only something that we've really started to tackle in the last few years. Because, you
Well,
know,
as a word, it's significantly younger than Asylum, wasn't it? So
it's
the
indeed,
word was coined in 1998.
indeed, but also just in terms of, like, you know, autism or whatever, that kind of,
Mhm.
we did have articles about, for example, the overlap between autism and schizophrenia in terms of
Mhm.
diagnosis. We had all that sort of stuff earlier on before the neurodiversity movement kind of blossomed. So we have been aware of the importance of those issues, but it's only been more recently that we've kind of, and I know some sort of people who call themselves critical mental health are a bit more suspicious of the whole neurodiversity movement, but we really are, you know, we try and platform and champion new movements like that. Even though, you know, there might be some issues with them, I'm sure there are, and we would want to have that discussed and be open. But we want to, and we also want to be there for when the next issue and the next issues come up. So, for example, the Stop Oxyvision campaign, they did a takeover of Asylum last year or the year before. I can't remember, probably the year before. And Stop Oxyvision are a group of young survivors who wanted to stop the use of CCTV cameras in psychiatric wards. And that was a really important campaign that's been incredibly important in terms of challenging those practices. And yeah, I want to see. So when things like that arise, to for Asylum to be open to that and to kind of go, you know, to cover it, and also to say, you know,
And to
here's some,
help it win, so you
and
can then
yeah,
move on to the next issue.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So, like, you know, hand it over to them, and then hopefully they will, you know, or cover it in regular news items, hand it over to, so they can publish articles about what they're doing, and then be open to where the next sort of struggle, if you like, is, or the next
Mhm.
thing that we need to know about, the thing we need to take action about, the thing we need to be aware of, the next thing that we need to know about, and be open enough to that. So one of the important things that Asylum is, or we try to be, is open enough to new ideas, not to be
Yeah.
fixed in our ideas. I think we talked about that before. Yeah. We don't have necessarily a strong opinion on things like diagnosis, medication, stuff like that.
Mhm.
You know, what matters to us is having that discussion openly, and patients' autonomy and decision making around those kind of issues. You know, rather than having a preset agenda about what those things should be, we want to make sure that we're there if an issue comes to the fore, that we can then open the magazine up to have those issues discussed.
Fantastic. And one last question, which is, if people watching this feel inspired and would like to get involved in and would like to support Asylum in any way, what are the various ways in which they can do that?
Okay, so we have a website, asylummagazine.org. If you've never heard about the magazine before, that's the best place to start. So we have sample articles on the website that you can read from the magazine. So you can read back issues, you can read sample articles, and after a year, you can read back. We upload the whole issue. We've not got the full catalogue online yet, but we're trying to develop that. But for the last 10, 15 years or so, all the magazines are available to download, apart from the 1 year embargo for subscribers to make sure that they get their issue. So you can start reading it. The other thing to do is to, if you want to contribute something, an article, a poem, a piece of artwork, a photograph. One of the things we really like is photographs of interesting, funny political placards around, you know, things, you know, messages and stuff like that. And if you're on a demonstration, for example, and you see a really good handmade placard with a good message that has a mental health, in inverted commas, kind of bent, you know, take a picture of it, send it to us. You know, we can include things like that. Can support the magazine by telling people about it, that it exists. You know, if you're a mental health worker or a service user or somebody interested in these ideas, you know, tell people about it. You can subscribe to the magazine. It's distributed by PCCS Books, and they take subscriptions for the magazine. Try and share it, get copies of it, share it with people, share the ideas with people. Once you've read your copy, give it to someone else to read, you know, pass it around. Maybe if you work in a mental health service or use a mental health service, if there are any mental health services still out there, if there are, which there are, we know. Yeah, maybe encourage them to subscribe or get copies in that project. Write for us, get in touch with us. The other thing is, if you know about anything that's happening at the moment, for example, you know, a campaign to save a mental health service or to shut down a mental health service, or a campaign to highlight a particular issue that's going on, whether it's an individual that's struggling for a particular, you know, service or a particular issue, if it's people that have maybe died by suicide because of neglect or particularly bad treatment, things like that, let us know about it, because we have a regular news column feature where we are always asking for people to tell us about local, national, regional, or international things that we need to know about. And we can include a paragraph in maybe even pictures and stuff like that in regular news items as well. So even if you don't want to write anything, but you want to tell us about something, tell us about a local campaign, tell us about something that's happening that we can cover, and then we can include details of how people can get in touch or support your campaign as well. Because we don't, you know, we want to be part of making things and part of making change, part of a broader movement, if you like. So part of that is reporting on it,
Yeah.
letting people know about it, and cross-fertilizing those things. So you go, I didn't know there was a similar campaign happening in my area.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have enough of that. Not enough people get in touch with us to tell us about stuff. We're only a small collective, so I only know about stuff by people telling us, unless I happen to hear about it.
Yeah, can people also get maybe their union branch or their tenants group or their local library to subscribe?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we've had over the years, often people have said to us we wanted to get their Unison branch to subscribe. We've often had people trying to do that. There's always been problems with that, which I've never really understood in terms of actually getting that to happen. I think it's often like getting it through branches, getting it voted in or whatever. And I mean, it's quite cheap. And also, if you talk to BCS Books, if you want to get, if you wanted to get a reduction in the price, there, I'm sure they would happily negotiate with, in terms of like institutional subscription rates, which are always higher than individuals. But if it's a charity or an organisation with not much money, I'm sure would have a conversation about that. I mean, PCS Books they're a book publisher, so they don't tend to publish magazines. So it's a bit of a side project for them that they do for a favour for us, really. But yeah, I mean, there's tons of things you can do. Also, you can get in touch, join the editorial collective if you're interested in getting more involved.
You can come to the online launch,
and you can come
issue that we do 4 times a year.
Yes, so every time we have an issue, as you know, we do a launch event where we invite people who've contributed to the magazine, whether it's they might have designed the cover, they might have people read their poems that they've contributed, people say a little bit about their articles. People don't read the whole article, they just say this is what the article's roughly about. So it's a great way to get a sense of what the magazine's about and what the current issues are that we're dealing with. And you can come to the online launch, they last an hour. And we have them 4 times a year. Each issue has been published. So this is the current issue. So we're going to be having a launch event for that soon. And once we've got a date for that, we can maybe put that in the description. So, and usually that's advertised on social media or on our website, just so people know about. We usually have it, a few weeks after the issues come out. So, and probably maybe about half or third of people who've contributed turn up and say something about it. And it's usually, I really enjoy sort of hosting it. Sometimes, I've had a lot of conversations with people who've written stuff, but I haven't actually met them, and then they come to the online launch. So it's great to kind of go, you're the person that wrote that. And I have to say that the poetry bits, when people read their poems, I'm not just saying this because you're there, is the best bit, actually. I have to say it's probably the best bit, because poems are brilliant and come to life being read out. They really do. And I think that's and you introduced the online launches as poetry editor, and I think for that reason, and it works particularly well for the poems. It works as well for people to get together, kind of go. I was saying before about the community and building community and alternative kind of cultures and stuff like that. Well, that's one way of doing it, so people don't feel so isolated. Because a lot of the people that write for Asylum, not all of them, but a lot of people may be quite isolated, they're isolated in mental health services because there aren't mental health services that bring people together anymore. They're all very individualized, or very few. And people are often like cut off in their own, but they can come to an online launch and meet other people who've also contributed to the magazine. So it's, it can be a really a good thing for people to get involved in. Not if you don't have to do it, if you don't want to, you don't. Plenty of people don't, but anyone can come to the launch and just hear about and hear the poems and stuff like that.
Cool. Brilliant. Thank you very much for answering all these questions, and congratulations on 40 years of challenging the mainstream narrative on mental health. And cheers. Solidarity.
Thank you.